moment.
We can't afford not to do this.
You can't just walk up and say, psych beds for all. This is not how the next mayor has to comport themselves. We need specifics.
Okay, Ms. Morales, you're up. Thanks.
Please, thank you. So the first thing I want to say about this is that, just to be clear, mental illness and mental health challenges are not crimes, and we have to make sure that we're separating those things. In terms of housing, I have spent over a decade making sure to connect homeless LGBT youth, homeless foster care youth, homeless people with mental illness, homeless people with substance abuse to housing. We have not made the commitment that we need to make to ensure that we are providing housing as a human right and housing for everyone. The first thing we need to do is to move away from the $3 billion that we currently invest in our shelters and begin to invest those dollars in the creation of permanent, affordable, really affordable housing for all people, right? Because Andrew is talking about the people that are afraid and that are leaving, but the people that are actually suffering deserve the kind of care and attention just as much as anyone else. And we need to prioritize providing those services for them. And that's the experience that I have, and that's what I would provide as mayor of New York City.
Thank you, Ms. Morales. Mr. Donovan, we know that you're an expert in housing, but what most street homeless people want is often for outreach workers who engage them to just go away. What would you do differently to bring those people indoors?
Well, you're right. This is the issue that called me to public service 3 decades ago. And I'm outraged that we have more people sleeping on our streets, in our subways, in our shelters than we've had since the Depression. First thing we need to do is keep people in their homes. There's billions of dollars of rental assistance available from the federal government, but we haven't put it to work quickly to keep people in their homes. Second, we need to make sure that we are focused on the problem of housing, not shelter. We need to reimagine our right to shelter as a right to housing and put that first. You know, I was talking to Charmian today when I was giving out meals with City Relief. She's afraid as a domestic violence survivor to go into shelter, shared shelter, where she's at risk. And the third thing we need to do is connect that housing to services. It's called supportive housing. I would build 2,000 more units of it a year. This is exactly how we made so much progress when I led the homelessness strategy for President Obama. We ended veteran homelessness in 80 cities. Mental health and housing can help with supportive housing.
Ms. Wiley, it can take hundreds of engagements with a homeless individual to coax them indoors. The city claims to have brought in 4,200 homeless people from the streets in recent years. What would you do that they haven't already tried?
You know, look, Shams DeBaron, who was one of the men at the Lucerne on the Upper West Side, is someone I've talked to much about this and is in housing right now, had been homeless, street homeless, substance addicted, when the response was to send more police into the subways where he was riding because the congregate shelters were so dangerous. He asked for help, and what he got was handcuffed and taken to jail, and our largest psychiatric facility in this city is Rikers Island. So let me just say right now that the premise is wrong because we have the ability to do outreach in the right way, but we simply have to use the right people. And the more we fail to recognize that we're spending $480,000 a year on that psychiatric facility we call Rikers, we're missing how we end street homelessness. I am the only candidate who has a subsidy program that will subsidize the rent for every New Yorker family of 3 earning $54,000 or less.
Thank you, Ms.
So
Wiley.
you don't pay more than 30% of your rent on the income on rent.
And by the way, how do you pay for that?
I pay for it with relief dollars that is coming from the stimulus package and the savings we get because we spend $3 billion to $80,000 a year on putting people in congregate shelters that are dangerous, that they don't want to be in and don't provide support services. And we already talked about Rikers, $480,000 a year, more than any other.
We have to move on with our questions, Wiley. Alan Villafani.
Who has not been convicted of a crime.
Alan Ms. Wiley. Coming out of the pandemic, a lot of undocumented New Yorkers are struggling. And we might not know how much they're struggling because they're often afraid to come forward. What's the biggest risk to undocumented people living in New York City, and how do you propose to solve it? You have 1 minute answer, and Ms. Wiley, I start with you.
Well, you know, as a civil rights lawyer who is proud to help get past the first sanctuary city law in this city, I'm going to start with understanding, one, that when I have mayoral control of the New York City Police Department, there will be no support or help for ICE in preventing any of our people from getting the services and supports they need. But I'm also the candidate that recognizes so much of who our essential workers were, who didn't get a dime in relief. I am so proud that Albany has fixed that thanks to the activism of organizers. But look, I have a plan called the Universal Care Plan that's going to create $5,000 grants each year to put in the pocket of the neediest New Yorkers. And people who do not have papers in this city are still our residents and will be eligible for this program, and a health plan, because those are some of the top costs of living, includes child care, so we'll have universal drop-off centers as well, but also health care, because we have 600,000 New Yorkers who don't have a health insurance card. I'm going to create a city health insurance plan for undocumented immigrants.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan.
You know, in a year when we've lost more than 30,000 of our neighbors, our immigrant communities have been disproportionately devastated. I've seen it in working to recover from crisis again and again, that those who are most vulnerable before a crisis hits are always hurt the worst by it. So we do need to lead with health care. I have a true public option that would be available to all the folks who lack health care in our city, more than 300,000 undocumented folks included. But we also need to make sure that we're dealing with the underlying disparities that led to the disproportionate death in our immigrant communities and our Black and brown communities in New York. My 15-minute neighborhoods plan would make sure that every New Yorker has, within 15 minutes of their front door, everything they need for opportunity: a good school for their kids, a job that sustains their family, housing they can afford, but also the health care that they need, fresh food, parks to play in, all of the things that really go to the underlying disparities in health care that we see again and again in our immigrant communities.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Morales, what is the biggest risk to undocumented people living in New York City, and how do you propose to solve it?
So the reality of it is that, you know, folks associated with this administration talk about having created a sanctuary city. But the truth of it is that we have not done that. We have failed our undocumented essential workers tremendously. And that's why I was proud to stand with the excluded essential workers in advocating for a state fund to help provide some economic relief. We've got to recognize that those are the very people that made it possible for so many of us to work comfortably from home at the height of the pandemic. So the state fund is great, but it's not enough. We need to extend those protections further. We need to make sure that we are truly decoupling ICE from all of our city agencies and services and rebuilding and regaining the trust of these workers who've made it possible for us to survive. That includes not just economic relief, it includes access to health care. And I've also advocated for giving them the right to vote in municipal elections, because we have to recognize what they contribute to our city, what they contribute to our economy, and the value that they bring to New York.
Mr. Yan, what do you have to say to the undocumented community?
The single biggest problem facing the undocumented community right now, the single biggest danger is poverty, where right now we're missing 500,000 jobs. And so if you were putting food on the table in another way, right now maybe that restaurant or business doesn't have a need for you and you have nowhere to turn. So priority number one is to try and get our economy revved up again, get some of the 66 million tourists back who supported 300,000 of the 500,000 missing jobs, many of which would be filled by undocumented immigrants. But we need to do more. I proposed $1 billion in cash relief to everyone in extreme poverty, which would overlap very heavily with the undocumented community. I proposed a People's Bank that would channel hundreds of millions of dollars into minority and Black and brown owned businesses in many of these communities directly, because the corporate giants are not going to be investing in that way. And we need to get them connected to basic financial services, because right now they're getting exploited by check cashing fees, money lending fees, remittance fees. We can get them bank accounts. And ID NYC, and a lot of them don't trust it. A lot of them are like, oh, if I show up, I'm going to run into issues. If we get them basic financial services, we can keep more of their money in their pockets. It should not be so expensive to be poor.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Mr. Adams.
In fact, it is expensive to be poor in New York City. And when you think about it, the days I spent with our essential employees, a substantial number of them were undocumented. They were delivering our Uber Eats. They were stocking our stores. They were out in the streets, keeping our city running. And so what we must do, I believe, at the heart of this, cities are made up of agencies. And if those agencies fail, it doesn't matter how much money you put into the city. And that's the problem. We must have immediate translation services to assist that people can have access to the services that are already available. We have to expand NYC Care to make sure everyone has health care. We need to make sure we have proper translation services in our schools so that we can start building out the future as well. And I, too, take my hat off to the state Senate. That was the right thing to do, because when an immigrant walks into the store and buy a loaf of bread, no one asks, what is your documentation to charge you those taxes?
Ms. Garcia, do you know the undocumented community, and what could you tell them?
I, too, am thankful to the state for giving us the $2 billion that is going to make it so there's immediate cash relief in people's pockets. We have to end our relationship with ICE and actually live up to being a sanctuary city. And how government chooses to design programs matters. When I was responsible for emergency food, there was no request for documentation. All you had to do was say you were COVID impacted and you couldn't go out, and we delivered you food, whether or not you went to a school or whether or not you needed it delivered at home. This is what we need to do for health insurance, to expand New York City Cares. This is what we need to do in all of our schools across the city so that families feel welcome. Because, you know, one of the facts is if your mother is literate, you are more likely to be successful in school. This is the type of mayoralty I'm going to run, because this is what you deserve as New Yorkers, someone who rolls up their sleeves, wakes up early, and makes it so that we deliver for you.
Mr. Stringer, what is the biggest risk to undocumented people living in New York City, and how can you help?
The biggest risk right now is city government's inability to actually run the programs and make the systemic change necessary. I talk about the lack of affordable housing. That's real for undocumented workers. I talk about an education system that is not meeting the needs of the children of frontline workers, undocumented workers, who literally risk their lives every day. Many died to make sure the rest of us had food. It wasn't government doing the heavy lifting. It was actually the people in the streets who, for very few dollars, protected us. We do not protect the prevailing wage in the city. We do not do the work to ensure that wages are fair. As mayor, I'm going to make sure that that happens, because as controller, I debarred 70 contractors who did not pay those wages to the people who needed the most. And also, we have to have real programs. Andrew's fake UBI program would only be about $5 a day for people who are poor in the city. That's 6% of the population. It's not universal. It's not affordable. There's no way to pay for it, and it would come at the expense of the safety net. Now, we have money coming from the federal government, but that money is not here permanently, and we're going to have to make sure the programs have lasting impact.
1 second. You directly mentioned Mr. Yang. Do you want to respond for 10 seconds?
That's a lot of money for someone who's right at that line between staying in their home or not being able to put food on their table. And direct cash relief has been demonstrated to be a massive success in alleviating extreme poverty in other environments. There's just a new study that said that my plan would reduce extreme poverty by 60%.
$5 Gentlemen, I'm sorry. We need to give Mr. McGuire a chance to answer that question. Mr. McGuire.
Can you just repeat the question, please? Because you have a lot of the politicians talking, and I'm not a politician, so sometimes it's difficult for me to repeat answers that don't apply to respond to the question.
Coming out of the pandemic, a lot of undocumented New Yorkers are struggling. We may not know how much they're struggling because they are often afraid to come forward. What's the biggest risk to undocumented people living in New York City, and how could you propose to solve it?
Let us be very clear. The problems that we're experiencing now are problems that existed before COVID, and all those who spent however many years in government all of a sudden have a plan to how we're going to address this. The challenges have existed, and they got exacerbated by COVID. They got exposed by COVID. So what do we need to address? We need to address the basics that all New Yorkers have come to expect. Yes, we're in a sanctuary city. We do not govern ourselves the way that that suggests a sanctuary city should govern. Safety. Undocumented don't feel safe. Jobs. We've lost however many jobs. In the Bronx, we're 15 to 20% unemployment. Healthcare.
We don't provide adequate health care. We clearly do not provide adequate education. And we clearly do not provide homes. So the undocumented, like many of the documented in the underserved communities, have not been served. And we need to have a plan to do that. And my plan to focus on jobs, the greatest, most inclusive economic comeback in the history of this city, is designed specifically those who've been excluded, like the undocumented, to get into there. No job, no city. No job, no dignity. It applies to the undocumented as well as it does to the documented.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. All right, candidates, we're going to give you each 30 seconds to answer this question. You will all get that allotted time, so keep that in mind as I ask it. But what is the worst idea you've heard from another candidate? And we're going to mix up the order. We're going to begin with you, Mr. Yang.
The worst idea I've heard from another candidate was Eric Adams' advice to bring a firearm to church as a public safety measure. I think it speaks for itself.
Mr. Adams, we were scheduled to go to you next. There you go.
UBI, it went from UBI that Mr. Yang had, then it went to Borough Bucks, then it went to Monopoly money, then it went to Hope and Prayer. You know, we have to have real solutions for real New Yorkers like my New York City cares.
Ms. Garcia, worst idea you've heard from another candidate in 30 seconds.
To be quite honest with you, these are complicated times, and several of my opponents are using hashtags, hashtag defund the police. I just don't think that's the right approach. You need to sit down and really think through these things.
Mr. Stringer?
I like Andrew personally, but I have to say the two craziest ideas I heard was TikTok houses for artists and then a casino on Governor's Island. I lost it after that, and so did my kids.
That wasn't a policy. That was just my suggesting something dramatic that might generate revenue for the city.
All right.
Wasn't a good idea.
Let's move on. Mr. McGuire.
Yeah, I've heard it from a couple of the candidates here who are trying to pander to what they think the voters want to hear. It is called the defund the police. As the way they've described it, will end up in disaster for New Yorkers.
Ms. Wiley, worst idea you've heard from another candidate.
So my godson, who is 6'3", 6'3" tall, black and beautiful, I've had to accompany him to court for riding a skateboard while black. I've had to accompany him to court for sitting in a park while black. And the worst idea I've ever heard is bringing back stop and frisk and the anti-crime unit from Eric Adams, which 1 is racist, 2 is unconstitutional, and 3 didn't stop any crime, and 4, it will not happen in a My Wiley administration.
10 seconds, Mr. Adams.
You don't have to worry about danger when you have private security on your block. I don't and never will allow stop and frisk to be returned and abuse people. I know real solution for real people in New York is you have private security, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff.
Eric Adams is stealing the monumentum, and let me just say that the important issue for New Yorkers that everyone understands is that public safety is broad, complex, and it means making sure we're spending our dollars wisely, and I will have a moral budget that protects all our people.
Let's be very clear for black and brown communities, neither defund the police nor stop and frisk,
You don't
nor
speak for
private
black and brown
security.
communities. How dare you assume to speak for black and brown communities
talk to
as
black
a
and brown
monolith?
communities.
You
I talk
cannot
to them.
do that. You cannot do that.
Oh, I
The
can. Yes,
defund
I
movement
just did.
actually was started
You know what?
by young
I
black
just
and
did
brown
do it.
people.
You know what? I just did do it.
You
You know what
can't erase them in that way.
Can't talk over
That's
each other.
your
I'm
truth.
gonna do it
It's not
again.
the truth for the community as a whole.
I'm going to do it again. Black and brown communities do not want either defund or
You
stop
are
and
not
frisk. Full
speaking
stop.
for all black and brown communities because I am a member of that community, and you are certainly not speaking for me.
Okay, let's exclude you.
All right.
Let's exclude you.
Candidates,
let's not
I need to
exclude
stop
me.
you, candidates, only because we need to give you, Ms. Morales, and you, Mr. Donovan, a chance to answer that original question. Worst idea you've heard from another candidate. Mr. Donovan?
Look, I don't think you tuned in tonight to hear us attack each other. So I want to talk about an idea I haven't heard in this campaign, and that's equity bonds to solve the racial wealth gap in our city. Every child born in our city should get $1,000 into an account when they're born, and every year, depending on their income, up to $2,000 more. That means a child born into poverty in our city would graduate with almost $50,000 in an account to pay for college, to buy a home, to start a business. If we really want to make this city more equal and more fair,
Mr. Donovan,
we need
that's
a
30
plan to
seconds.
attack the racial wealth gap.
All right, and just to be clear, you do not want to identify the worst idea you've heard from another candidate. That was your 30 seconds.
I've heard a lot of bad ideas focused on, but I don't think that's why folks.
Ms. Morales, that question goes to you.
Thank you. On May 29th, 2020, I watched in horror as both of my children were pepper sprayed by the NYPD. Within an hour and a half, I watched in horror again as my son was physically assaulted by the NYPD. At the time, we were all together exercising our civil rights. So one of the things that I think is highly problematic is the idea of, first of all, rejecting and attempting to represent the black and brown community in terms of defunding the police, and what I've called for is divesting and investing. And the second thing is flooding our subways with more police officers to address the social issues of homelessness and mental illness.
That's 30 seconds. Thank you, Mr. Morales. Candidates, we have this question. We're looking for short answers if you could, but with just a few words. Tell us the one problem facing the city that you really don't feel you've figured out how to solve yet. We'll start with you, Mr. McGuire.
The one problem facing the city that we have not solved is education. If I look at what's taking place in the borough of Brooklyn, 7 out of 10 of our children do not read at grade level. We spend $27,000 a year educating unsuccessfully our children and $426,000 a year keeping an inmate at Rikers.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Mr. Schrader, something that you, as you look out at the city landscape, you have just not figured out how to solve, even if you became mayor.
I think there has to be a renewed focus on taking time to listen to communities when it comes to reinvesting in neighborhoods post-COVID. We know that the virus discriminated, but I think so far, if we're seeing from the de Blasio administration and the spending of the dollars, we're not having the conversations necessary.
All right, Mr. Sugar, thank you. I have to move on, candidates. Looking for short answers here. Mrs. Garcia.
I have to agree with Ray. We have to make sure that we are getting our education system right and that we are doing things that make it so they go into careers.
Garcia, thank you. Mr. Adams.
Education, pregnancy, through profession, returning the joy of learning to school.
All right, Mr. Adams, thank you. Candidates, this is a problem facing the city you do not feel you've figured out how to solve. Mr. Yang.
How to get our broken bureaucracies to genuinely deliver value to us, the people and families of the city, whether it's education, sanitation, public safety, housing.
Thank you. Ms. Morales.
You know, I think about the combined sort of climate and infrastructure transportation issues here in the city, and how it is that we leverage community groups and advocates in order to begin to solve that. I was proud to sign on to Transportation Alternatives 25 by 25 plan,
Ms. Morales.
but I'm going to need their help in executing.
Ms. Morales, thank you. Mr. Donovan.
Look, we've still got more than 500,000 New Yorkers who are out of work. We need everyone in this city to come together to focus on our small businesses, and we need to fill our vacant storefronts, our public spaces, with arts and culture. Let every New Yorker know that New York is New York again, and let the world know that we're coming back.
Ms. Wiley, problem that you don't feel you've figured out how to solve yet.
You know, one of the things we have to create is renewable energy cooperatives in communities. Communities like Mott Haven that has 21 times the rate of asthma of any community in the city. Climate crisis we can solve, but we do have to figure out how to create renewable energy in communities so the communities are benefiting fully and actually own those businesses.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley. Candidates, thank you. Now, we're just about at the 1 hour mark of this mayoral debate. So we're going to take a brief time out, and in the next hour, we are going to tackle the city's economic recovery,